All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel entitled Responsible Investment is Here to Stay. My name is Andrew Collier, and I am the Director of Freedom to Invest at Ceres. Freedom to Invest was established in early 2023 to be the spearhead at pushing back on state and federal legislative and administrative efforts to prohibit investors from considering specific risks and prohibiting responsible business practices. Freedom to Invest, along with many of our allies and partners, have worked across the country to ensure lawmakers are educated on the unintended consequences of such efforts. As a part of that coalition of folks who are speaking up and pushing back, investors play an essential role. Today, I'm honored to have two of those investors with me to speak on the freedom to invest and the efforts and successes at the state and federal level, and to talk about why responsible investing is here to stay. Joining me today are Sarah Benatar, the treasurer of Coconino County, Arizona, and Alex Chapman, president of Ridge Creek Global, an investment firm based in Ohio. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello to you as well.
All right, well, let's dive in. I'll start with the first question. Feel free, either of you, to answer. But at both the state and federal level, we've seen ongoing legislative efforts seeking to restrict investors, companies, and financial institutions from considering the financial impacts of certain material issues in decision making. Last year, there were over 140 bills introduced in the states, and six were signed into law. This year, over 100 bills were introduced, and seven were signed into law. Many of those were watered down from their original form to be simply messaging bills. From a 1,000-foot view as an investor, both in the private and public sphere, where do you see this headed?
I'll go. I'll take a swing at it. The thing that, looking at from a 1,000-foot level that I find concerning is, with the recent actions, it's very broad-based. It's not, there's one small issue they're trying to address. They're trying to attack an entire number of metrics to investments. And so far, it seems like they have a lot of momentum still, but from a we'll say a libertarian point of view, um, you're just creating more government, creating more, they're trying to say they're claiming clarity, but they're actually not. Because now they're deeming random metrics that they don't like as, you shouldn't be allowed to do it, which is muddying the water for a lot of different types of investments.
And to add to that, Alex is spot on, right? We're seeing they're getting broader with the language. Yes, you've seen perhaps a slight decrease in what's being introduced at the state level, but they're still being introduced. I don't think it's going to be going away. And the broadness of it is adding a lot of confusion and a lot of concern. I know in the public sector, it's about investments. It's about us issuing debt. It's about, the whole spectrum. It's our retirement. It's your taxpayer dollars. And so, it's the broad piece of it that Alex hit on is again very concerning with how we do business, especially when we're trying to be prudent investors and we're trying to follow that standard of care, but it makes it very difficult for us to be able to do so when they keep introducing these very broad ideological ideas and legislation at the state and federal level.
Yeah, and that's great, Sarah. And we'll really get to that broader effort. I know you saw some of that in Arizona this year. But more broadly, what kind of economic impact will these restrictive proposals have on state employees and on taxpayers?
So I always say when government costs go up, that means taxes go up, unfortunately. Someone has to pay for it. And governments are funded by especially at the local level, taxes, whether it's sales tax, property taxes. And so, it's borrowing costs. Across the spectrum, costs will go up significantly. I'm not talking about a little bit, a couple extra bucks. We're talking about significant increase in costs for us to just do basic business. And then you look at it from employees' perspective. I'm a public employee. I have a retirement plan based in the state. How many employees are we talking about? Teachers, your law enforcement, your first responders, and these bills, they're going to impact and they're going to have economic impacts on our ability to be sustainable when it does come to retirement age. Are those dollars going to be there? What is it going to look like, especially when we start talking about increasing costs? So if costs go up, that means that your property taxes may go up, your sales revenues taxes are going to go up. And again, that's a big dent in terms of overall the economics of a state, of a community. And at the end of the day, your ability to plan for the future. We want to make sure that our employees are planning, for a prosperous future, and this would impact it economically in a very big way.
Alex, anything to add to that?
Well, I can't say in the public sector, but I would say, when it comes to investing, a challenge that's being created is, they're trying to go after ESG as one of the main areas. Well, what is that exactly? As governance, G stands for governance. Um, so how, that's about board and how the board operates and how elections are done. You're putting legislation restricting that for the shareholders. It creates fundamental questions like, then do they decide what a good governance could be? When it comes to environment, when you think about certain forever chemicals, can we not think about those type of things? So it creates, when looking at companies and looking at whether you want to be passive and more just looking at the financial statements, more active and talk about management, it creates this headache of, does me, following a certain path violate some of these new standards that they want to create, cutting these out. And so there is a challenge of, now there's a very muddied line, that you cannot be in violation of. So that's where I see the challenge growing.
Yeah, and that really hits at the next question that I have, which as investors, when evaluating material risks and opportunities, can you talk about how fiduciaries might consider E, S, or G criteria to maximize returns? What are the real world examples of how they're utilized?
I actually want to even take a step back. In this whole narrative, it's when you're being a fiduciary, it's about return and also risk. It's risk return, characteristics. If it's strictly return, in theory, you just take your money to Vegas and bet on, a number on roulette. If it's all just about return, but it's about the risk return balance. And so, for example, if you're looking at insurance companies, you know, environment is a big part of their business. When you're talking about homes and you're talking about auto, hurricanes, climate related events, if you look at that and take that into your metrics, do you get in trouble? When I think about environment and social, I think of forever chemical lawsuits. You have some major industrial companies in the United States which have a huge amount of potential liability from forever chemicals. Right now, you look at the earnings per share, their revenue growth, they have decent numbers, but they're, compared to some other peers, they're at a discount because they have this giant overhang of forever chemicals, which can fall under if you're saying, I'm not going to buy that stock, or if not, the price, I'm going to give a lower price target because of these. Is that going to be violating now some standard? Because you're using environment and social into the calculation. So it does have, even today, real world impact on investing and how, fiduciaries are supposed to be thinking about investing these assets.
And Alex mentioned risk, and from public sector point of view, we always talk about safety first, then liquidity, and then we're looking at income last. And so by removing and really limiting our ability to assess risk, we're putting in jeopardy, our taxpayer dollars, investments for retirement savings for our public employees, because we're not able to consider that. We're essentially saying the most important thing is not risk, which again, I have a responsibility. Public fiduciaries, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're preserving principal. So me not being able to preserve principal by looking at all the risk factors is huge. And so by looking at things like ESG, I really am saying let's look at all the tools in the toolbox. Let's use everything accessible to make sure that we're assessing every investment from a prudent investor standpoint, as opposed to trying to chase income. Because by doing that, we're going to, in nature, invest in much riskier options, which again means I'm not preserving that principal. I'm not doing my due diligence and making sure that we're protecting taxpayer money and employee monies when it comes to retirement savings plans.
Yeah, and to that point of risk, and I know you had mentioned earlier about how the attacks have become more broader. This is a question directly for Sarah. In May, Governor Hobbs vetoed SB 1094 in Arizona. It was so-called anti-discrimination bill that would have prevented financial institutions from accurately assessing risk using standard industry practices. Can you tell us a little bit more about this legislation and how it would have raised borrowing costs for Arizona businesses and families by forcing lenders to really ignore legitimate risk factors?
So great point, right? SB 1094 was vetoed by the governor, or Governor Hobbs. And from my perspective, it does result, as you mentioned, and would have resulted in increased costs. And why do we say that? Well, there's a number of different factors. So if financial institutions are not able to consider all risk factors, right? If they're not able to look and assess specific industries that are riskier, that means that they are essentially going to adopt more risk, which means costs are going to go up. That means the lending costs in Arizona will be higher because they can't take a look to assess things individually. So even though if you are a less risky business, they're not going to necessarily be looking at that factor. Then you look at, Arizona, we are competitive when it comes to, we're attracting a lot of industry in here. Are they going to stay? If they don't stay, or if we start seeing a shortage there, costs again go up because we do have less resources, we do have less job creation. All of this in the long run too is going to cost more for families and for businesses. Again, everything comes down to risk. I know I'm saying this a lot, but risk drives price. That's just the truth of it. And so if you can't assess risk, you're going to assume that things are riskier. And if you can't look at different factors, again, you have this more broad interpretation of it. So at the end of the day, you're doing business in Arizona is going to mean I can't look at certain things that are standard practices in other states if I'm going to lend to you. So you know what? We're just going to acknowledge that it's just a riskier investment by doing business in this state because you can't look at all the factors that you normally would. So, at the end of the day, there's always cost associated, an increased cost. They're taking on that risk, and so we have to pay for it. And businesses are struggling. We're seeing Arizona water issues. I mean, I'm going to tell you right now, small businesses in my own county, for the giant fires that happen in the North Rim and the Grand Canyon, it's huge, right? And so we know that they're already taking on more debt. They're going to have to take on more debt. And so again, it is a factor in Arizona. We are aware of that. We're seeing these climate disasters happening every day in our backyard. And so we need to be able to allow the industries to be able to evaluate that effectively.
Yeah, and that specific bill, SB 1094, we saw several iterations of that around the country. And it also failed in other states, in places like Texas and Georgia. In Georgia specifically, a very similar bill failed on the Senate floor. So, when speaking about the broader coalition of folks working on this, there are a lot of groups and individuals that would be impacted by this type of legislation. Um, Kind of switching gears a little bit, a question for Alex. I think in June, the House of Representatives passed HR 2988, and this is specifically the House Education and Workforce Committee. It did not get a full floor vote. This bill is called the Protecting Prudent Investment of Retirement Savings Act, and it would amend the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which is ERISA, so that fiduciaries of private pension plans cannot consider ESG factors when investing. Can you tell us a little more about how this legislation would undermine prudent investments by causing a chilling effect on fiduciaries' consideration of certain material risks and opportunities?
I think when talking about this, an interesting point that doesn't get discussed, when you think about things like pension plans or specialized plans for religious groups, is, they have other metrics that they sometimes like to use. There are religious-based funds which, have to, try to follow those religious tenets. And if you ban ESG or these other criteria, all of a sudden you're making basically them illegal, and people have to then invest in things that goes against their beliefs. And, with pension funds, certain pension funds, all else being equal, will look at, oh, do they use organized labor in these investments? And I'm saying all other things being equal. And basically, some of this legislation, since that could be considered, social, would say that's illegal. So you're telling pension funds, you're telling, basically certain people with religious beliefs, etc., these different groups, um, you're taking away their rights of how they invest their money. Um, when it comes to your personal money in your retirement 401k, other types of plans, shouldn't you have a voice in how it's invested? And shouldn't also the members, it's a pension fund, but it's still, the members are in charge. They vote on the boards of these pension funds. And you're basically saying they couldn't have certain voices when it comes to investing. And so there is a chilling effect because you're taking away shareholders, and at the end of the day, people the rights to invest their money in the way they see fit for their beliefs, amongst other things. And so, it does open this can of worms of where do you draw the line? What is quote unquote prudent? So it creates a lot of headaches, and it's solving a problem that's really not a problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Alex, and I think it really heads to this next question. So, as you know, Freedom to Invest as an initiative, we've had to adapt to the ever-changing political landscape, both in the states and in Congress, from working on ensuring financial institutions are able to consider all material risk when lending, to ensuring that shareholders continue to have a voice. Shareholder resolutions are a key mechanism in which investors are able to engage with companies on a variety of material topics, such as climate risk management, executive compensation, independence of directors, and non-discrimination and diversity practices. In your opinion, how does the shareholder proposal process play a critical role in our dynamic capitalist system?
Oftentimes it's forgotten that a shareholder is the owner of the company. At the end of the day, the management works at the discretion of the board, and the board works at the discretion of the shareholder. The shareholder is the ultimate risk taker of the business. If a company fails, a public company fails, the shareholder loses everything. The board and management, they'll get a nice check. They still get severances of some kind, even the bankruptcy process. Some of them continue to work on it to reorganized. But for the shareholder, you're taking all the risk. And part of the benefit you get with taking that risk is having a voice. So when you talk about these things, saying what should shareholders have the right to propose, at the end of the day, it's their company. They may be a small shareholder, but they should still have that voice because it still is their company. Why the management or the board telling the owner of a company what he or she cannot do? If you really have, shareholders who constantly do proposals or things like that, first, there are mechanisms to make sure you can't do that. And second, though, if it keeps getting its voice heard, maybe that tells you something about the management and the board of the company. There's a reason that these proposals are getting some traction. And that should be a voice to the management and the board that they're not probably doing something right. And so anything you do to take away that voice of the shareholder, you're atrophying freedoms and also the compensation for risk. And you're replacing it with some, I don't want to go to an extreme, but you know, is there going to be some shareholder proposal czar on the board to then determine what is appropriate and what is not? And do you think they're really going to be, oh, I really care about the shareholder, that's the reason I put all these restrictions? It's like, no. If you do a great job at the board and the management, the shareholder should be glad to go along. Why do you need to put these limitations? That's what I kind of think. You're limiting the freedom of the owner of the company for a lot of other reasons than, oh, it's too hard to have these proposals.
Sarah, anything to add to that?
Alex, you hit that one spot on. For me, I report to taxpayers. So from a public's perspective, right? It's our shareholders, our taxpayers, our constituents. And so we should be able to, and we need to recognize what's important to them, where their values are reflecting it. And yeah, I mean, Alex, you hit it spot on.
Yeah, and Alex, you've had the opportunity to meet with members of Congress and their staff to really talk about not only anti-ESG legislation, but the shareholder proposal process and why it's so important. Can you talk about that specific experience and any advice that you have for investors and tell them why it's important to have those conversations?
I would say, like the shareholder, going being a shareholder and proposing things, just like the legislature, you are a citizen of this country, get your voice heard. Make sure your voice is heard or else someone filled in that void for you. And that's why it's important to do these trips, to go to DC, to go to the reps' offices, to go to senators' offices, because you're educating them. You're advocating without educating. If no one's telling them, look there's another side to this. The shareholder should have a side, should have a voice in all this. Someone else filled that void. And it's generally not to the shareholder's, interest. And so that's where it's very engaging as well, because, a lot of the members of the legislature, they're dealing with a $6 trillion budget. They're dealing with constant challenges, within that budget, within new legislation. Their time they can spend on these topics is limited. So if you can get time to get your voice heard, that is very impactful. If they spend time and their team spends time with you, because they have a lot of things to cover. And so that's why it's important to go and to advocate. Because if no one goes, there's no problem. That's basically the mindset. But if people show up and people talk about it, then they realize, okay, I should listen to all the voices in this to make sure that I can have come to the right conclusion, hopefully.
No, that's a really great point, Alex, and so glad that you've had that opportunity to meet with members of Congress, but also representatives in states. Sarah, back to your point about again this being such a broad effort from opposition. What are your biggest concerns with how all of this has metastasized from attacking asset managers of public pension systems to financial institutions and utilities and insurance companies? We've done a lot to push back, but why is now much more important than any other time?
It's for me, it's definitely one where we have to, right? This is not going away. This is not a battle that's going to be going away, and we need to preserve that our ability to invest responsibly, to have that independence. Whether you wherever you are, right? At some point, this is going to impact you. I tell my constituents, this impacts everyone in my community. It impacts, our children, it impacts our employees at the county, but it impacts anyone who lives in our community from a government perspective. And so it's really important to get involved, to go advocate, to speak out, to be aware, and to, again, just really be vocal about that independence, and ensuring that we are able to look at all the risk. We need to be able to do our jobs. We need to be able to preserve investments in our financials for the years to come. I've got a kiddo. I want to make sure that the school districts have what she needs. I need to make sure I have a retirement plan. When I'm finally able to retire, which is ways away. And so we need to make sure that we're preserving what's so essential to making sure that our investments are protected, which is that ability to evaluate risk and invest responsibly. I will say too, think outside the box. It's is impacting, like I said, everyone. So it's impacting businesses. It's, you're seeing across the country. This isn't necessarily just a one group issue. You're seeing businesses, you're seeing chambers of commerce, you're seeing investors, you're seeing financial institutions, you're seeing government entities really coming together to talk about this, and how we can attack it, and really say this is why this is so important for us to preserve it. So as they're getting broader, as they're trying to dilute it, it's still there. And so for me, the biggest thing is once it's in the books, it's easy to add a word or two later when it's in, state law or federal. It's so even if it's diluted, it still makes it easier as you go forward. And we've seen bills across the years do that, very limited, and then it expands once it's passed specifically in this area as well. So I just think, continuing to advocate, educate, and speaking out right now, we need it in order to preserve it.
Yeah, and you really hit on a good point there about being able to consider long-term risks as a fiduciary, whether that's extreme weather or drought or wildfires. It's so critically important. And, Alex, I will say it'd be great to hear a little bit about how you kind of communicate across party lines. Right now, there's almost as though political dysfunction in America. How do you best communicate to both parties about this specific issue?
When I think about it, obviously I come from more of the Republican side, to say the least. Um, but it's basically about, you know, what role does the government have in the system? Why should the government, at the end of the day, you're increasing regulations. And is that really the best in a regulation area that is really the best use of expanded government? Does it benefit the people it's supposed to be serving, or just creating more barriers? And so that's where I really come when I approach it with the members of the legislature. It's just, why are we curtailing freedom? And I think that's the point that I always try to get across. At the end of the day, the investors are people. This is their assets. Why are you, if people have rights to have their own views, to have their own opinions, to live their lives, why are we putting restrictions on how they do it? And a big part of your life, surprise, surprise, is your money. Why are we putting all these limitations on it? If people don't like the way their money's managed, they can go, roll it over. They can tell their who's ever managing it, you know, if they're in a retirement plan, I want to retire a bit differently. What options do you have? There's so many different ways, and now you're kind of limiting that bucket. You're saying, no, no, we're going to cut out options. And at the end of the day, why are we doing that? Let people march with their feet and put, do what they want to do with their money. And so that's the thing I always preach is about, why we restricting freedom.
Yeah, that that is so true. Well, we are out of time, but I really want to thank both of you. To see also if you have any closing words of wisdom that you could offer folks before we end the session. I'll start with you, Sarah, and then we'll go to Alex.
No, I would just say thank you to those who are there who are doing this and speaking out and making sure that we're preserving our ability to evaluate and assess risk at all levels. So keep it up. If I can ever be of service, I know I'm guessing our contact information will be shared. Please reach out, but hang in there and keep fighting.
Yeah, and I'll follow up. I'll close with this. Have your voice heard in every aspect. If you don't have your voice heard, someone will replace your voice with their voice, and their voice is magnified. So make sure you have your voice heard, but also make sure that you're talking to the audience, depending on what type of dialogue they're on, and language they understand. Telling someone they're just bad for this, you think they're bad, probably not the most effective way. So when you do talk to those on the other side of the aisle, talking in languages, at least they can, nod their head a little bit. If you can get them to nod their head, you've already won, 3/4 of the battle. So remember that. So talk to your audience the way that they will nod their head, not lecture them. So have your voice heard and, reach out.
All right. Well, thank you so much to you both, and I appreciate everyone for listening in on this session. As Sarah mentioned, I think our contact information will be shared. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.